Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Kathy Gu, and most of you already heard her presentation this morning. It was really good. And this morning, she spent quite a time on startup and also conflict of interest. And at least I find 3 key words in the area of conflict of interest. One is disclosure. The other one is review. You have to review and get approval by college or university. And then the third one actually is the management. Conflict of interest in the university, to be honest with you, you cannot avoid. On the one hand, you want to be a good professor. On the other hand, you want to try to make more money, right? Even though last speaker say, well, they're going to pay more. And maybe we can find out later in that last panel discussion exactly how much he's going to pay to those senior professors. So the management part is very important. It's going to happen. And actually in Taiwan, somebody asked this morning, we already have 2 big cases, all involved with very leading scholars at Academia Sinica. And that created a lot of problems. So management is the key. So Kathy, you got to tell them how to manage the conflict of interest. Let's give Kathy a big hand.
Well, I feel like Carol. I don't want my talk to be boring. So what I want to do is start up with a little bit of history at Stanford. Our office, our technology licensing office, is 47 years old. We actually started in 1970. And so again, all of our policies have evolved over time, and they have been different. Under one president, early on in the 1980s, with the start of biotech booms, that then president felt that we should be very, very careful about conflict of interest. And President Kennedy at the time said that we should not go into business with our faculty members. So he did not want the university and the faculty members to hold stock in the same entity, because from his perspective, it would be going into business with faculty. And at the time, because he was so concerned about conflict of interest, then he also said that OTL could only grant non-exclusive licenses to a faculty startup. Now, those of you involved in the startup scene know that a non-exclusive license is somewhat useless. It is basically the freedom to practice the invention, but it doesn't give you any advantage at all. And so again, pretty much we missed the whole biotech boom, because at that time, a lot of startup companies were being formed in biotech. And at the same time, they were going public on very, very early stage research. They didn't have to have a clinical product in the pipeline or anything like that. And so again, from a financial standpoint, Stanford did not take advantage of that boom of biotech industry. Now, over time, Stanford realized that maybe it's not so worrisome. And again, this president stepped down. We had another acting president for about 1 year. The provost became the acting president. And we had a situation where there was a startup company. The funding was from a VC firm. And then typically we would give licensing rights back to the company. So it was clear there was going to be a startup company. And so we went forward and asked the president then, is this okay to do a license to this startup company. And we did this license, and it turned out, because of the negotiations, this was very, very unusual. We had about 20% equity stake in the company. And we ended up realizing it's too much. We still didn't want to vote, but not voting 20% is giving a lot of control to 80% of the others. So that particular company actually did do well. It was Amati, and then it was acquired by ICOT, and then it was acquired by Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments became our licensee. They ended up paying a royalty. They tried to do infringement suits, et cetera, but we realized that we had held too much equity, and that was not a good idea. Therefore, the policy has evolved to have a 10% cap. We also, when that company went public, we realized that we didn't want to hurt the company by selling immediately. And our policy is to sell immediately when possible. We are not trying to gain the upside for the stock. We want to divest of the stock because we don't want to be accused of insider trading. We know a lot about the company because they're supposed to give us yearly reports. So we divest of our stock immediately when we can. However, we held so much stock that we didn't want to hurt the company, so we put ourselves on a plan, sort of like Carol's plan, where we sold about a quarter every quarter, and within 1 year we got rid of all the stock. So this was the early 1990. And then we had a policy change. The Faculty Senate debated the conflict of interest policy. Prior to then, the patent policy was such that if an inventor, a faculty, invented something under gift funds, then the faculty would own the IP. And if the faculty then developed an invention under sponsored research, federal funding, or anything like that, the university would own the IP. And the faculty themselves realized that kind of a policy puts the faculty in a conflict of interest position. So we asked the faculty, who funded this invention? And you can just hear, you can see those wheels turning. Should I say the gift funds, then I'll own it, or should I say sponsored research and the university will own it? So by virtue of that sort of generous patent policy, we were putting the faculty in a conflicted position right then and there. The other thing was to realize that, well, the faculty would have used, let's say theoretically, the same resources. If it was under gift funding or university-sponsored research funding, the same resources, so why should the intellectual property be disposed of so differently? So the Faculty Senate decided that we should make the patent policy uniform. Our patent policy is that if there's any invention developed in the course of university responsibilities or using the Stanford resources, then the university would own it always. So again, in the early years, we were still worried about equity. And so the original policy after 1994 was we could take equity, but we wouldn't give a share to the inventor. And so the inventor had to agree either they would give their share to the university or the university wouldn't take equity at all. So of course, many of the faculty would have said, okay, well, the university can own it. But sometimes there were inventors who said, no, I'm not going to give my share to the university, therefore you should not take any equity at all. So that seemed to be an awkward situation for us too. So over time, we finally did come up with a policy where we can take equity, we can share with inventors, we share with the, equity is not shared with the department or school because the department and school control the space allocation and tenure and promotion decisions. So we don't want the department or school to be influenced by the potential financial gain of equity. So the equity that stays at the university goes to a central Dean of Research, my boss, who then can allocate the equity however she or he wants to. So I'm going to go over, many of the slides will be somewhat similar to this morning, and then I'll go to the detail, which I think will be just a little more, more in depth. So our conflict of interest policy is on our website. We promote the public good by fostering the transfer of knowledge. We do feel that this is one of the missions of the university, and that it is wrong for an individual's action or decisions made in the course of their university responsibilities to be determined by consideration of personal gain. So we say that personal gain should not determine what happens to an invention. And just as Carol said, we want objectivity in research. This is really important. And it depends on the design, conduct, and reporting of the work must be free from bias, from financial interests. So we are really wanting to make sure that the research integrity is kept and that we keep the trust of the public. So again, I talked to you this morning about when does a conflict of interest review happen. Actually, it happens every year for all faculty. They have to submit a conflict of interest disclosure. They can say that there is no conflict of interest. That would be a perfectly fine disclosure. But if they have done anything that would create the appearance or the actual conflict of interest, they should disclose it annually. And we get 100% compliance with that. That happens annually, everybody does it. Then there are these what we call ad hoc disclosures, whenever there is a triggered event that creates a new situation that doesn't happen yearly, it just happens when it happens. So we would call that an ad hoc disclosure. For all of this, we have an online system. So the faculty can submit it. We used to submit it by paper. Now it's online, so the reviewers can look at the same document at the same time. So again, like Carol, if the faculty has a financial interest in a company, if the company funds research in the PI's lab, we actually do not encourage that. Unlike Berkeley, we are more reluctant to take sponsored research from a startup that involves the faculty. If the company gives a gift to the PI, again, we want to make sure that the gift is used really as a gift and not to create intellectual property for the company. At Stanford and most other universities, a gift is a gift that cannot carry intellectual property rights. If we are going to license technology that has the faculty as an inventor, we will have a conflict of interest review. And if the company is a member of the industrial affiliates program, we also have industrial affiliates program, but the faculty has a financial interest in that company, they have to disclose. So there's a conflict of interest review for very similar situations as Carol was talking about at Berkeley. So again, we said that the conflict of interest on startups is focused on conflict of interest management. We do this for publicly held companies too. But again, the chance of a faculty influencing a publicly held company is much smaller, and their stock holdings will probably be much smaller. So again, I've mentioned this already. We negotiate an arm's length license. We don't give more favorable terms. And again, we know that they're often going to part ways. And so we have this, we talked about it this morning. We talked about this morning, and again, we say that the faculty cannot negotiate with OTL. Again, talked about this morning, they have to separate the research. They have to be sure that they're going to protect the student from conflict of interest. Talked about this morning. We send the disclosure, they review it. The inventor submits the similar information I'm going to talk about the actual questions. We talked about this. All right, so the disclosure for the faculty, they have to disclose the nature of the current or planned relationship. A lot of faculty will come forward and say, well, I'm not officially a consultant yet. Do I have to disclose? We say, yes, you have to if you're contemplating this. If they're on the board of directors, they have to indicate these roles: board of directors, advisory board, consultant, and a founder or co-founder. I mean, typically their arrangement, even if they're going to be on the scientific advisory board, is as a consultant. It's usually through the consulting mechanism. So almost all the relationships look like a consulting relationship. We are going to talk about the licensing. The faculty will talk about the licensing of the IP to the company. They will explain their holdings. We don't care so much about the actual amount, although we will have ranges. They will have to say, is it a stock or stock options? The conflict of interest group wants to know if there are payments to the inventor for IP that was developed outside of Stanford and licensed to the company directly, maybe from the inventor. We will want to know payments for lectures, papers, reports, product evaluation. We will want to know the complete financial relationship with that company. Sometimes the faculty is a legal consultant. They might be an expert witness on IP. If they take a leave of absence, they can be an executive or an employee of the company, but they cannot be those positions when they're faculty at Stanford. And like all the other financial conflicts reviews, we have to look at the spouse, domestic partner, a dependent child. We don't go to the second level as you all do. And any other relationship with the company they should disclose. This is a fairly thorough disclosure. So then the person actually does have to talk about the nature of the company. Is it privately held or publicly traded? It's typically privately held. That creates the most potential conflict. But if they have a financial interest in a drug company or something, they do have to disclose that too. Any income from the company to the faculty, and it's usually a dollar range. We're not that interested in the exact dollars. And when they consult for a company, they're supposed to provide the Stanford consulting policy that in case of a dispute or conflict of who owns the IP, Stanford's policy prevails. So again, they are supposed to provide this policy to the company. So when we're looking at conflict of interest with respect to research, would the financial interest reasonably appear to be related to their academic responsibilities? And would this financial interest have the potential to significantly affect the financial interests of the company? So again, when you're a founder, sometimes you'll hold a lot of equity and be able to influence the financial future of the company. That will be more conflicting, of course, than if you have a very little bit of equity. And also, reasonably appear to be related is very likely to be reasonably appear to be related because that is their field. So again, these things would be reviewed. Does a company do anything to benefit the faculty? Do they sponsor research in the lab? And again, this includes human subjects research, a clinical trial, anything like that. Does the company have any commercial interests in the lab? And typically they shouldn't have commercial interests in the lab, but you also need to know whether other people in the lab are involved with the company. You definitely do not want many people in a laboratory involved with the same company. Does the company give gifts to Stanford to benefit a lab or a person? And then is the product under study in the lab? And then, as we said, like material transfer agreements, sometimes we will get materials from a company or the faculty want to give materials to the company that they're involved in. This would be reviewed. Now, when we're talking about can it be reasonably appear to be related to their research, the conflicts of interest person will sit down with the faculty and talk about their federally sponsored research agreements and what they're doing in other areas, because we do have to meet with the federal compliance of conflict of interest. So again, we need to see how close is this research or the IP involved with the company. So they do talk to the conflicted inventors. They will review the status of research leading to the technology, what started this, and then what other research is going on. Just as I mentioned, they will do an overview of the research in the lab. This is done by the conflict of interest person, not OTL. If it's too related, if their research is very related to the actual IP and would benefit the company, we might try to manage that a little more or suggest that the faculty might change the direction, or we say no more research is going to go into that company, no more IP. If it's a broad area, a lot of faculty just do basic science and they have a broad area of cancer immunology or kinetics or whatever, then that would probably be allowed. But again, if their research is too specific to the interests of the company, it might not be allowed. We would try to manage that. So the question is whether it's potential or actual conflict of interest. Those are two different things, but we also are very worried about potential conflict of interest or the appearance of conflict of interest, because we would want an outsider to be able to say that this conflict has been managed. So if the research could have a direct and significant effect on the financial interest of the company or of the research going on, we were going to have to manage this. If the conflict is very much right on, we will have to report it to the funding agency, the government funding agency. Typically, we try to take steps to manage the conflict of interest. Now, there are many ways to manage conflict of interest. We could ask, for instance, a committee to oversee the faculty research. We've decided that doesn't work because faculty friends will say, okay, this is fine if you tell me my conflict is fine too. So we've decided that management by committee is not, faculty peers is not a good idea. So we actually have a much more objective view. What if there's an unmanageable conflict? Then they might ask OTL to modify the agreement, just as was described with MTU. They might say only a non-exclusive license. They might say limit the field of use, limit the term of the license, limit the field of exclusivity. They might ask faculty whether they would like to change the research direction. We've had one case where the faculty was asked to change the research direction because the research in the lab was so directly affecting the company. And so they changed direction. It's at their willingness to do that. But again, we probably wouldn't have approved the conflict if they wouldn't change the research direction. We can also suggest that the faculty give up the financial interest. Sometimes faculty are very interested in getting sponsored research from a company, and if they have a financial interest, we're less willing to do that. So they might rather have no financial interest in the company and get the sponsored research money. So again, we leave this choice up to the faculty, and if the faculty doesn't want to make a choice, then we'll probably modify the license agreement. Now, inventors get a share of equity from the license. Basically, our royalty sharing is the same across the board. It's not negotiated. 1/3 goes to the inventor, 1/3 goes to the department, and 1/3 goes to the school. again, as I said, we're a very school-based organization. Equity goes to the inventor. They get 1/3 of the equity that we get as Stanford. Again, as I said, we liquidate as soon as possible. And because we have that rule, we don't want to hold the equity for the inventor. So when a company gives stock to Stanford, we also specify in the license agreement that they will issue the stock directly in the name of the inventors. Because many inventors will want to hold on to the stock longer than we would want to. And we don't want to be accused of selling too early or too late, et cetera, et cetera. So Stanford does not manage the stock for the inventors. Our Stanford management company manages the stock. As we were talking about at lunch, the Stanford Management Company manages, it's 30 billion, something like 30 billion in assets of the university. They have no idea what to do with a small cap, privately held company. The Stanford Management Company manages managers who manage the equity. So they're not in the position to decide to hold or not hold. So again, that's part of the reason for this policy to liquidate when possible. Otherwise, they just sit on it and take care of the shares. Okay. What I wanted to talk about was institutional conflict of interest, which is one of the topics that you asked me to talk about. The broader institution might have a conflict of interest. There are two areas that we're very concerned about in our institutional conflict of interest policy. One is human subjects research. Again, we are very, very concerned that we don't have patients that are not being treated fully well because of some financial conflict of interest. And we don't want to look like we have a potential financial gain to say a clinical trial went well because the public could think that we were trying to increase our stock value. So we were very, very careful about human subjects research and clinical trials. We also care about the institutional leadership, institutional conflict of interest. So we have a policy where, how do we handle this? I'm going to talk about institutional leadership right now quickly to sort of get it over with. If the dean or department chair has a financial interest in a company that is doing a clinical trial by a faculty under them, they have to recuse themselves. So they cannot influence the outcome or be directly supervising that faculty member for potential conflict of interest issues. They have to disclose any financial conflict interest in the company that's doing a clinical trial. And so the rule is $25,000 for publicly held companies or $25,000 in a privately held company. If they have that much equity in a company, these institutional leaders have to disclose that. So I think the institutional leadership conflict of interest is pretty standard everywhere. So I would like to focus more on the human subjects research and the potential conflicts there. So, startup happens, we license this technology to a startup company, and so we have equity in the company. Subsequently, because they're working with our faculty, and because they like our research clinical trial capabilities, they're going to fund a clinical trial at Stanford. We're holding equity. It could be perceived that we're trying to influence this clinical trial. So, if a clinical trial happens at Stanford after we've licensed the technology, we will sequester the royalties. We'll put it in sort of like an escrow account, which we are not going to touch for at least 10 years. I'll give you the details later. So that if there's any perception there's conflict of interest, we are not going to get a financial gain. So how do we even identify institutional conflict of interest? It's actually really hard. So the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, sends our office all the protocols that involve company-funded sponsored research. Now, I would say 95% of them have nothing to do with our licenses. They're big pharmaceutical companies that are funding research. It's not based on our IP. We don't have to do anything about that. But every once in a while, we'll see a protocol that involves a company that we've licensed. So again, it's needing to know who we've licensed and what technologies we've licensed to them. If a startup company is doing a clinical trial on technology that we didn't license to them, that's actually okay, because they're not doing a trial on our technology. On the other hand, if they're doing a trial on our technology, we identify it, we tell the Institutional Conflict of Interest Committee, and we will then sequester it immediately. We sequester both equity and royalties. We have decided, though, we've gotten a little bit fine about this. If it's an annual payment, it's not related to any kind of development progress. So we're able to keep that. But if it's an earned royalty, we sequester that. If it's a developmental milestone, making it to a phase 1 clinical trial or phase 3 clinical trial, we will sequester that money. Patent reimbursement we can take because it's just a set amount. But again, anything that's related to any developmental progress around this product, then we will sequester that money, both equity and royalties. So again, this is sort of a big deal. We've sequestered, I think, about 10 companies, we will keep this until certain timelines. So, how long do we sequester? 10 years from publication of all the results of the clinical trial that created the conflict. So again, many times there's a multi-center trial or there's some publication that's going to come out of the trial. We hold off for 10 years until that time period is over. So that makes the licensing office need to keep track of these publications, and I'm not even sure that we have been able to do that yet. Or if it's the end of the clinical trial, 10 years after the clinical trial at Stanford, then we will unsequester it. That's the 10-year rule. Otherwise, if FDA has approved the product, we can unsequester it because we feel that there have been multi-center trials. It's been proven and approved by the FDA. They've looked at the data very carefully. So our clinical trial at Stanford has been part of a much bigger picture. And once the FDA approves, we're okay to unsequester this. Many times the license is terminated. If there's no future development by the company, we can unsequester that royalty and equity. Or if the product is no longer being developed by the licensee. Sometimes they don't quite terminate it, but they're not developing the product yet, or they have no intention, and then we can also unsequester that. Now, the exceptions are if a member decides not to do this research, then there's no institutional conflict of interest, obviously. As Carol and I both said, we don't allow the faculty inventor to do the clinical trial. I mean, typically it has to be someone who's totally uninvolved. Typically that protocol director doesn't even know we have a license. We have licensed the technology to the company. They are that separated. So the reality is that most times the protocol director and the IRB approval of the consent forms, et cetera, of the protocol, they have no idea that we've licensed the company. So in reality, it's very, very separated. However, we're worried about this perception of conflict of interest, and so that's why we manage it so carefully. Sometimes if it's a platform technology, and it could be used broadly, and so it's not product specific, then we wouldn't sequester the royalties. If it's a tool, we wouldn't sequester the royalties. Again, this is determined by the Institutional Conflict of Interest Committee. And again, the reality at Stanford is we don't have many real committees that meet. And so this Institutional Conflict of Interest Committee right now is composed of, again, the dean of our designee of the School of Medicine, and then our dean of research. So they often decide between themselves whether this would constitute a conflict of interest. We involve the conflict of interest person, but it's an institutional conflict that they're trying to manage. So ensuring that the integrity of research is not tainted is really the utmost. We go through the conflict of interest review for any potential licensee, and then we try to do the conflict of interest management and the institutional conflict of interest management. That's more important than any licensing income. And that's always very clear. We are in this business to make an impact, and the university doesn't judge us on how much money we bring in. So again, one of the things that came up early in our discussion was how much do we ask for a startup license? And I think you would be surprised. We don't ask very much. We know that a startup doesn't have much money, and so we will be fairly modest in what we require for an upfront fee. We do ask them to pay us patent reimbursement for the patent expenses. And then in the early years, we're sharing the risk with the company. We want them to be successful and use the money to develop the technology. So it'll be modest yearly payments. And then we feel that if they're successful, then we'll get the return from the earned royalties or the milestone payments when they've de-risked the technology. So again, we're trying to enable startups to happen, not to discourage them because there's such a financial burden at the beginning. We do lots of startup licenses, as I mentioned. We have done about 300 startup licenses cumulatively. I would say we have probably 150 left. And I would want to say that actually it turns out that the equity cash out, except for Google, tends to be very minimal, especially in biotech. So the Google cash out was $335 million. That was an IT play. Again, often in IT, the cash out is greater and it's a surprise. We've had some recent surprises where we've had licenses to startups last for 10 years. We think nothing is happening, and all of a sudden they go public. Tableau was one of our more well-known. They're a data visualization company. They went public. We were really surprised because they had been quiet for a very long time. There was a code checking company called Coverity. We thought it was a mom and pop operation. Didn't expect much, and all of a sudden they were acquired by Synopsys. And so again, that was a really nice equity cash out. Aside from the $335 million from Google, which was represented only 2% of their equity, we sold right away when they went public. We've made only $60 million in equity cash outs. And that it would be from about $1.3 billion of royalties. So again, 60 million is very little. So we don't count on equity as a big financial win. It's sort of considered icing on the cake. And if we're lucky, it'll be worth something. Typically, our philosophy is to take equity in as many companies as possible. And typically in any 1 year, we might have some cash out, 5 or 6 companies, and I can usually expect around $3 million a year for equity liquidation, IPO, cash out. Otherwise, again, it is just part of our scene. We get way, way more money from royalties than we do from equity. So we believe that the management is possible. Again, I said we don't prohibit conflict of interest. We manage it. And we want to maintain the public trust in the results of our research. That's the most important, because if we lose the public trust, then we don't become revered institutions. We lose that reverence by the public. I think that's all. Yeah.
We have a few minutes for Q&A. And before you go to jail, this is a good chance to ask questions. Kathy and Carol as well, of course, got a lot of experience. And in fact, I involved a couple projects to review the very big, they call national research project to see this possibility for licensing startup. And I suspect if we're serious enough, couple of the lawyer should go to jail. And I'll tell you why. We have a faculty that one day we asked him to give us a presentation and, which company you're going to licensing to, or you're going to start a new company and all that. And that day, certainly we find there's a lady we never seen before, and she's sitting there. And one of the, coordinator from that university asked the faculty, say, well, who is this lady? And why is she there sitting next to you? And she said, oh, she's my wife. And I'm going to start a company, and she's going to be the chairman. Okay? So, so this is part of the issue I think actually happened here. So, well, in any event, something really serious. Others probably, as Minister Chen mentioned, some of our law and regulation and guideline may be not that clear. So this is a good chance for you to ask questions. Anyone? Okay.
I would say to Paul that sometimes wives are very competent and have experience and should be CEO.
Oh, after they serve the jail term, right? Okay. Anyone? All right, please. This one first, and there, next. Please mention your name and who are you? And
I'm Dr. Chen from Yangming University. And I would like to continue Paul's story in Academic Sinica, a very famous researcher in Taiwan. And he donated his gear, his technology to a company. And his daughter purchased a lot of stock from that company. And then it's a big, like some problem in Taiwan in political issue and also in financial. So I would like to ask Kathy, if this story happened in the States, how come would it be?
Well, I think if the daughter is old enough, we would consider that separate because we just care about dependence.
His daughter is already adult, and he purchased the stock by herself.
Well, the question would be more insider trading, it seems.
Yeah.
Right? Whether she knew something more about the company than the public did. Which she might have.
And how about if the money is from her father? I think that's one of the issues, right?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, that might not sit too well.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if they already disclose all of this interest, is there any problem if they have this disclosure at first?
I mean, obviously somebody reviewed it, Is that?
Yeah, if they already reviewed by the anesthetic in the first.
If it was objective, I mean, if the reviewers didn't have a reason to be too nice to the person and reviewed it and thought it was okay, I think that's what you would hope. You need to have somebody review something, and if they reviewed it and said it was okay, then it's probably okay. I mean, I don't know whether it was reviewed by one person or a committee or what the review entails.
That's right. I think that's probably the key issue. I think Kathy mentioned, number one, as I said earlier, is a disclosure, right? So this person has to disclose any financial interest and probably how many share of the stock is going to get it, and any relation between the inventor and dog. You know, of course, there's relation there, and but I don't know. And again, of course, number two is have to go through the review process, right? And then probably in that case, I don't know, maybe they will say something this is not appropriate or something like that. And then probably stop there, and they have to either make changes or something like that, you know. So that'll be, you know.
Thank you.
Okay. There's one person there.
Hi, Kathy. It's Jan again. I'm from National Taiwan University. So I have a real case that's ongoing right now. So we're going to start like multi-nation, international trial. It's a proof of concept trials. The original inventor team has filed all the necessary IPs and all that. But since this is part of kind of, what makes the package more complete, through this multi-center clinical trials, would there be any concern that we need to be extremely careful about in terms of the IP generated from this proof of concept clinical trial? By the way, it involves Stanford too, so you'll probably see the case pretty soon.
So usually a typical clinical trial has a protocol already. So there's a recipe. So it's unlikely there's going to be intellectual property. That's usually what we think. Some universities, and we too sometimes, if it's a faculty-initiated protocol, then we might not give the intellectual property to the company that's making the drug or whatever. If it's a sponsor-initiated trial, where the sponsor gives the protocol to the person, and a group has to follow the recipe, then we would often give the intellectual property to the company.
So this case is a little bit different. It's still on the proof of concept stage. So everything, although it's a multi-nation international proof of concept clinical trial right now, it's still considered as an investor initiative. It's not the sponsor initiative.
You would have to negotiate each time. Okay. With each university.
I see.
Some universities are much more strict about if it's investigator initiated, then the university will own the IP.
I see.
If it's the company initiated, typically the company will own the IP.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, final question for this session. 你还有，等一等，后面还已经有一个人。
Yes. I would like to ask, how do you do the due diligence of one invention? And do you have separate teams to deal with inventions in like biotech area and engineering area? Because sometimes in the single university, they're like engineering base or medical base. They would view this value differently. And for example, if you have a new chemical entity invented by your faculty, and it's going to license out to a startup, maybe one university would ask for a very big share equity and also unreasonable value. So how do you deal with this?
So I always say reasonableness is in the eye of the beholder. Companies never want to pay anything, and universities always want more. So again, what is reasonable to one party isn't necessarily unreasonable or not. So the question is, we almost never try to get a lot of money up front. So as I mentioned earlier, the process is a disclosure comes into the office and it's assigned to a person. We have probably about 12 professionals who do licensing, and they are in different areas of expertise. So again, a biotech person will be different than a EE, electrical engineer. And they will know the industry handles inventions and royalties in different ways. So again, we try to be reasonable. We are. One time we talked to our president, President Hennessy, who was previous president, and he said, if you don't do a deal because of finances, you've not done a deal and you've not done your job to transfer technology. So we will almost never not do a deal because of finances. So each company comes to us with their sad story. They don't have any money, they can't raise money. But we've heard this so often that we're not necessarily convinced. And because our office is so experienced, we're 47 years old, we know what is a typical range. We don't ask for a lot of money up front.
So can you give us a little like number in numbers? If this invention is related to new chemical entity, and or this is a formulation, or this is a simple medical device, like that?
Well, again, each thing in those industries, and invention in those particular industries are very different. We would think about the margin in the industry. A pharmaceutical will have a much bigger margin. They can handle a higher royalty. A medical device, if it's in a very crowded field, probably doesn't have a very much gross margin. We'll probably only get a low royalty. Just because it's a new chemical entity, if you license it to a company, they're going to analog it and analog it and analog it, and pretty soon it's going to be a different, somewhat different molecule. So again, it's an interesting thing because just because we have this embryonic, fairly early stage invention, doesn't mean it's so valuable because it's still so risky to develop. So we take that into consideration. If it's fairly risky technology, we're not going to ask for a lot up front.
How much is not a lot?
So, to be very honest, not a lot is about $10,000. A medium size up front would be 25. We'd really like to have 25.
That's very reasonable, actually.
Really
but here,
like,
sometimes we ask a lot.
So, I always say, you know, in the Bay Area, which is very, very expensive, it costs $15,000 to have your child in daycare. So if a company cannot pay $10,000, it seems sort of sad because they really are trying to give birth to a company just like you would take care of a child. So again, a reasonable amount of money. Some companies want to pay $1,000, and we'll probably say no, that's not reasonable. If a company is a big company might be able to pay more, and they'll probably trade off the earned royalty be lower. But when we're willing to take the risk with a startup company and charge only a modest amount at the beginning, then we want to share in the upside. It's a trade-off.
Thank you. I'm very happy to.
By the way,
$10,000.
if you, I don't know, you're a member of LES, Licensing Executive Society, they have magazine every year. They have some kind of statistic. And you can see that upfront payment royalty rate for different type of technology, and also they separate in big company or small medium. So that will help you. Because panel discussion is better, actually, I tell you.
Okay.
Everybody stay for the final discussion. Will get a pretty good deal because First of all, I will chair the discussion, and all the answer you will receive not only just individual, but from different people. And I think that will be a good opportunity for us to, have some good exchanges. Okay? Thank you very much.